Hello, everybody. Welcome. We're just going to take a minute or two and let people come in, and then we'll get started. Hey, Daniel.
Hey.
We're just about to get started.
I just sent a chat, but I'll watch the comments on YouTube.
Thank you. So Daniel, you want to turn off your camera?
You ready?
Yep. Thank you. Okay, it's 5:32. I think it's time to start. My name is Amy Janess. I'm programming coordinator at the Nantucket Atheneum, the public library for Nantucket. And on behalf of the Atheneum and the Nantucket Conservation Foundation, we're so pleased to see you tonight and to welcome you in. You'll notice at the bottom of your screen, there's a button that says Q&A. So at the end of Karen's talk, she's gonna answer questions. So as we go along, if you think of a question, feel free to put it in the Q&A, or at the end, you can put it in the Q&A and we'll pull those up and go through those at the end. The only other thing I really have to tell you is that Karen Beattie is in her 28th year at the Nantucket Conservation Foundation, where she is Director of Science and Stewardship. And so take it away, Karen.
Thank you, Amy. And before I launch into my PowerPoint, I just would like to say thank you very much to the Atheneum for hosting this evening. It would be much nicer if we could all be together in the Great Hall, which is such a great venue for having a presentation, but being able to do this online is a great option for us given the situation we're in right now. So I am going to hopefully be sharing my screen. Just figure this out. And do that. Whoops. Okay. So thank you for joining me this evening and listening to me talk about one of my favorite species of birds, the American oystercatcher. What I'd like to do this evening is talk a little bit about the natural history of oystercatchers that breed on Nantucket and some of the conservation work that the Nantucket Conservation Foundation is doing to protect this species, along with a number of other conservation groups on the island. And then I also want to share with you some of the range-wide movement patterns, information on where our birds go at the end of the breeding season that we've been able to ascertain by putting color bands on these birds and working with a large group of other researchers that are part of the American Oystercatcher Working Group. So before I talk about oystercatchers, I'd just like to put a quick plug in for the Nantucket Conservation Foundation, my organization that I work for. Many of you are probably familiar with our work. We are a private nonprofit conservation group that operates only on Nantucket. We were formed in 1963, and we rely entirely on membership donations. We do not get the 2% transfer tax that goes to the Nantucket Land Bank. So all the work that we do is due to donations that we receive from our members and supporters. So if you're not a member, please we cordially invite you to join us. Please become a member. We are the largest landowner on Nantucket. We own a little over a third of the island, or about 9,000 acres. And all of our properties are open to the public from sunrise to sunset, which has been particularly important during the COVID experience that we've been having here, that these properties are available to people to go outside and social distance and enjoy nature and just kind of forget for a little while about what's going on around us. As you can see from this map, we do own a lot of coastal property, including most of Coatue, the Hall over Eel Point. These properties that we own provide important habitat for American oystercatchers, and so this species is a really high priority conservation concern for us. So this is our study subject for this evening, the American oystercatcher. As far as shorebirds go, you definitely do not have to be a birder to be able to identify oystercatchers. They're very distinctive looking, and there's literally no other bird on Nantucket that looks quite like this. They have a very long reddish orange bill. As the name implies, they use this bill to open mollusks such as oysters and clams. They also use it to extract marine worms from soft sand and mud in salt marshes. Some of their key diagnostic identification traits are a red eye ring, a yellow eye, black, brown, and white plumage, and pale pink legs. And when they're in flight, they have a broad white wing stripe that is really visible when they're flying. So this is something to look for if you're trying to identify oystercatchers. In addition to being very identifiable by sight, they are also have a very distinctive call, which hopefully if the technology works, you'll be able to hear this. But I think for many people, this is kind of the sound of hopefully the next time you're out on the beach and you hear the sound, you'll know that this is an American oystercatcher calling. American oystercatchers, in terms of their distribution, as the name implies, they are largely limited to the Americas, North America, Central America, and just a little bit of South America. Here in Massachusetts, we are in the very northernmost part of their regular breeding range. So the northernmost regular breeders are up in the Boston Harbor Islands. South of New England, oystercatchers occur year-round, all the way from New Jersey down through Florida, into Louisiana, into some parts of Central America. And then the area that you see in orange is where you find oystercatchers that are not breeding during the non-breeding season. And we've been able to get some interesting information on who these birds are down in this area of the Americas through some of the banding work that we've done, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Prior to 1900, there's not a lot of information about oystercatcher populations and where they were, but it's widely believed that they nested all along the entire Atlantic coast as far north as Labrador. But during the late 1800s and early 1900s, a number of things were occurring that really detrimentally impacted their populations. Shorebird hunting became a very popular thing, both for hunting birds for sport and hunting birds for food. And because these birds are so large and obvious, they were really easy targets. So needless to say, this had a negative effect on their population numbers. Coastal development and salt marsh filling, a lot of that was going on in this country at that time in the late 1800s. This is just a graphic of Boston. What you're seeing in the brown is the city limits in 1775. Everything you see around that is basically filled land that used to be salt marsh or beach habitat that was available for shorebirds. So a lot of the historic habitat that these birds used has been developed over time in this country. And then in the late 1800s, there was a very peculiar fashion trend that happened where for some reason women thought that it was very trendy to adorn their hats with bird parts and bird feathers. This became the rage, and it was a big prestigious thing. And needless to say, hunting of birds increased to provide feathers and bird parts to accommodate this fashion trend. And in fact, this is actually what spawned the formation of the Massachusetts Audubon Society outrage in response to this fashion trend. So at least something good came of it. But all of these things really lessened populations of shorebirds in general and oystercatchers in particular, and led to the passage of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act in the United States in 1918, which made it illegal to hunt and capture or sell shorebirds and migratory birds in general, which was a really important milestone in the United States. In 1929, Arthur Cleveland Bent reported that the northern end of the breeding range for oystercatchers was in southern New Jersey. So the species had not yet made it back up to New England at that point in terms of recovery from the persecutions I was talking about in the previous slide. In 1948, The Birds of Nantucket was published by Ludlow Griscom and Edith Folger Andrews, and they did not include oystercatchers on their systematic species, species that were listed as being on the island. I had the good fortune of knowing Edith Andrews later in her life, and I know for sure that if there were oystercatchers here, she would have found them and she would have documented them. So oystercatchers are relatively new to this region of the state. In the Birds of Massachusetts, it's reported that the first 20th century nesting of oystercatchers in Massachusetts was on Martha's Vineyard in 1969. And it is a couple of years after that when they first showed up on Nantucket. So they've only been nesting on Nantucket in recent times for about the last 50 or so years. But as you can see from this map, we do have quite a few oystercatchers nesting on the island as of now. This is the nest distribution from 2019, when we had 41 breeding pairs on Nantucket and Tuckernuck. Oystercatchers also do nest on Muskeget, but we can't get over there as regularly to do census work, so they're not included in this number. That compares to 211 pairs statewide. So as you can see, Nantucket and Tuckernuck together have almost 20% of the statewide breeding population of oystercatchers. So this is a really, really important area for them. You'll notice the distribution of where these birds nest on this map. They don't tend to occur on the east side of the island or the south side of the island. They don't like areas with high wave action. They like more sheltered spots, such as you find on Coatue, the Hallover, Eel Point, Smith Point. And what all of these areas have in common is that they're close to salt marshes. So salt marshes are really important habitats for oystercatchers. They use them for feeding, and they also provide an important place where they hide their chicks. So oystercatchers arrive on Nantucket to start their breeding season in late March. And anyone who is a year-round Nantucketer knows what the weather is like here in late March. It is not pretty on Nantucket in late March. We still have some lingering coastal storms from the winter. It's cold, it's windy. So these are really hardy birds to be coming here under those conditions and starting their breeding season. They start to lay eggs in mid-April through June. Their clutch size is 3 eggs. The first nest at least is 3 eggs, and they will re-nest for up to 4 times if they lose their nest, the first or second or third nest. However, subsequent nests very often don't have 3 eggs. They'll only have 2 eggs or 1 egg. As you can see, the eggs are really cryptically colored and they are difficult to see on the beach. So if you're walking through an area where oystercatchers are nesting, it would be really easy to miss this and potentially step on it. They do nest in the open sand, but they will sometimes nest in cobble, as you can see for that nest on the right side. And for some unknown reason, they do sometimes decorate their nests with eggshells. The incubation period for oystercatchers is about 27 days, and both parents incubate the eggs and care for the chicks. The chicks are very mobile as soon as they hatch, and they will leave the nest within 24 hours, although they don't tend to range over wide parts of the beach as do piping plovers do. They pretty much stick close to the nesting areas. The parents sound alarm calls when they perceive a danger, such as a person or a predator coming. And the chicks hunker down and hide when they hear that alarm call. And they are very, very effective at hiding. This is a picture of a Dusty Miller plant where our former Coatue Ranger Neil Foley found a chick hiding out in there. As you can see, they are very cryptically colored and they blend in really well with things like eelgrass and dead vegetation that is on the beach. And they like to hunker down next to driftwood and other things that have washed up on the beach. So if you're in an area and you hear oyster catchers doing an alarm call and you don't see the chicks, that certainly doesn't mean that they're not there. They're just hiding very well. It takes about 35 days for the chicks to fledge, and the family groups do stay together for quite a while after fledging. We often see adult birds feeding chicks even after the chicks have been able to fly. So this is the time of the year when you tend to see these family groups hanging out together. And the way that you can tell the adults from the chicks is they are pretty much, the plumage is pretty similar. The chicks are a little bit smaller, but the chicks always have a dark tip on the end of their bill. It takes them a couple of years to get that full bright orange bill. So that's a good way to tell if some of the birds you're seeing at this time of the year are adult birds or chicks that fledged for that in that year. Later in the fall, some of these family groups get together in multi-family groups that congregate in places like along the beach on Coatue, where we have seen flocks of upwards to 50 birds. They're very noisy and very vocal, and they talk to each other quite a bit. And what we kind of like to think is that they're discussing where they're going to go for the summer. For the winter. So rarely do you see these birds in the winter. Occasionally one will show up on the Christmas bird count in late December, but they're never here during January and February for obvious reasons. They head south, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. The chicks, it takes them 3 years to reach reproductive maturity. So they tend to disappear after they fledge, and we don't tend to see them for about 3 years. And we've learned some interesting information about where they go. And in general, this species is really long-lived. So some of these birds can live for over 15 years. In fact, we have a couple of banded birds on Nantucket that are pushing 17, 18 years of age. And that's a really long life for a bird like a shorebird. We do a lot of work to protect the nesting habitat for American oystercatchers on the Nantucket Conservation Foundation's properties, and I will say that all the other conservation groups on the island do similar work. The Trustees of Reservations, Massachusetts Audubon, the town of Nantucket all work hard to protect nesting habitat for the species on the island. We do monitoring to figure out where their nests are, and then we put symbolic fencing and signage up. We exclude vehicles and unleashed dogs because they're very disruptive to these birds, and do a lot of public education to people that we meet along the beach about why it's important to protect them. In fact, this is a sign that we developed here on Nantucket to use in areas where oystercatchers nest, where we don't also have piping plovers and terns nesting, because all of the signs we had were specific to those other two species. So this is a Nantucket specific oystercatcher sign that we developed to use on our properties. Oystercatchers face a lot of threats. I mentioned earlier development of coastal areas, which has led to a loss of habitat, but sea level rise is also becoming more and more of a problem. In fact, over the last 5 years or so, we've really noticed that one of the major factors of nest loss is increasingly becoming overwash from high tides and storms. Human recreation in their breeding sites is never a good thing in terms of cars, in terms of unleashed dogs and people walking near their nests. But it's also other passive things, such as discarded fishing line that is on the beach. This, I don't know if you can tell from the picture, but the picture in the upper right corner is a carcass of an American oystercatcher that was found on Coatue that was sadly had its legs entangled in fishing line. And these birds are also impacted by predation. Here on Nantucket, we don't have a lot of ground predators such as they do on the Cape, coyotes and fox and skunk, but we do have a lot of avian predators. There's a huge nesting gull colony on Coatue. We have a lot of crows. And then this year, just this year, for the first time, we had a pair of nesting ravens on Nantucket. And all of these avian predators definitely will prey on eggs and chicks of oyster catchers. So oyster catchers were listed as a species of high concern by the U.S. Shorebird Conservation Plan in 2001. At that time, their population size was estimated to be at about 11,000 birds range-wide. 11,000 sounds like a really large number, but when you think back on the map that I showed at the beginning of the presentation, that range extends from Massachusetts all the way down through Texas and into Central America. So 11,000 is really not a very big number at all. As I mentioned previously, the population is expanding to the north, but over the last 15 years or so, it's been noted that there's an overall decline in the population by about 10%. So that is definitely not a good trajectory for the species to be on. So in response to declining numbers of oyster catchers, the American Oystercatcher Working Group was formed in the early 2000s. And this is a range-wide collaboration that includes over 40 agencies, including government agencies, organizations such as the Conservation Foundation that are private nonprofits, research institutions and colleges. All of these groups are operating all along the Atlantic coast with the objective of understanding movement patterns and estimating population trends, and then using that information to develop conservation strategies to hopefully prevent this species from further declining. One of the ways that the Nantucket Conservation Foundation has been participating in the Oystercatcher Working Group is by doing color banding and resiting work here on Nantucket to complement work that's being done all along the range by other partners in this working group. And I will mention that a lot of the information that I'm going to talk about that we have found out about our oyster catchers and where they go has been gleaned from the hard work of a lot of different agencies and organizations and research institutions. So we're a very small spoke in the wheel, and a lot of the information that we know we have found out from working with our colleagues at the Oystercatcher Working Group, which has been really fantastic collaboration for us. So what we've been doing on Nantucket since about 2005 is we have been putting unique field readable codes on oyster catchers. Because oyster catchers are large shorebirds, you can actually put a band on their leg that can be read with either a spotting scope or a pair of binoculars. And it's relatively easy with some practice to read these unique codes, which are individual to each bird. And what this allows is that individual birds can be identified and tracked in the field over and over and over again without ever having to be recaptured and handled, which, as I mentioned, these birds are long-lived. So if you band them as chicks, you can get upwards to 15 years worth of data on where that bird is going and what it's doing over the course of its lifetime. So that's been really fantastic opportunity for us to get some great information. Here in New England, we are using yellow codes with yellow bands with black codes, but there's a number of other different color combinations that have been used by other groups along the coast. And I'll talk about the different states in a minute that are using these different colors. So in terms of results of the color banding work we've been doing, through the hard work of many, many people, we've been able to band 386 individual American oyster catchers on Nantucket, Tuckernuck, and Muskeget between 2005 and 2020. As you can see from this graph, a great deal of these birds are chicks. The chicks are just easier to catch than the adults are. Also, if you put bands on the chicks when they're just fledging, then you can potentially get an entire lifetime's worth of information from that one bird. 74% of the oyster catchers that have been banded on Nantucket have been observed at least once somewhere else. So that's a really fantastic statistic in terms of recite numbers. So I just want to share some of the interesting things we found from all of this work. A total of 343 individual color-banded oystercatchers that were either observed or abandoned on Nantucket have been recited at least once outside of Massachusetts. We did have one bird that took a wrong turn somewhere and wound up in Maine, but for the most part, all of the birds on Nantucket head south once they leave here. New Jersey seems to be an important stopover spot. And then the southern states from Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and in particular Florida seem to be areas where they either stop over on their way to somewhere else or spend the winter. So in terms of Florida, 36% of the birds that we have on Nantucket here wind up in Florida during the winter. This is just a graphic showing some of these results. Again, coastal areas from Virginia south to Florida seem to be important wintering habitat. But in particular, there's this one place in Florida called Cedar Key, which is located right here. It's not in the Florida Keys, it's off the west coast in the Gulf of Mexico, is a really, really important site for Nantucket oystercatchers. And that's where we have our highest concentration of oystercatchers observed during the non-breeding season. 609 out of 1,716 total recites have been recited in Cedar Key. I will say that in terms of this data, there is a caveat to it. It is biased towards areas where people are out actually looking for these birds and reporting bands. So we know that birds occur and have been recited at the places on this map where you see the orange dots. But the areas where there are no orange dots, that doesn't necessarily mean that there were no birds there. It just may have been that there were no people out there actually looking for them, if that makes sense. I wanted to touch a little bit on some research results. Sean Murphy is he worked on Tuckernuck studying oystercatchers from 2005 to 2007. And along with his major professor, Dick Veet, was really instrumental in getting the banding work up and running here on Nantucket. And Sean went on to get his PhD studying oystercatchers. And he worked with a number of other colleagues to publish a paper analyzing the migration patterns of banded birds that bred in Massachusetts, 118 of them, banded birds that bred in New Jersey, and banded birds that bred in South Carolina, and found some interesting patterns that I just want to go over real quickly. So in terms of our Massachusetts birds, during the winter, if they bred in Massachusetts, they were not recited in Massachusetts during the winter, which makes sense. A couple of them were recited in New Jersey. None of them were seen in South Carolina, and 42% of them were 42% were seen in Florida. In terms of the New Jersey breeding birds, 33% of them stayed in New Jersey. None of them came to Massachusetts, which makes sense. Again, none of them stayed in South Carolina, and 21% of them wound up in Florida. So that population in New Jersey is partially resident and partially migratory, whereas the Massachusetts birds are completely migratory. As far as South Carolina goes, this is really interesting. So obviously none of those birds are going to go north to Massachusetts or New Jersey. 100% of them stay in South Carolina, and none of them go to Florida. So the birds in South Carolina are completely resident, and they stay on their breeding territories year round, and they seem to be particularly effective at keeping birds from further north from coming in and usurping their territories, which suggests that at least in South Carolina, some of the habitat might be limiting. And so these birds are just hanging out on their breeding territories and defending them year round. So birds from further north come down the coast, they kind of skip over South Carolina, and then they head to Florida, in particular places like Cedar Key. So if you're an oystercatcher and you're nesting on Nantucket, why would you migrate to Cedar Key? What is it about Cedar Key that's so important? There's a number of interesting things about this area that make it particularly conducive to overwintering oystercatchers as well as other shorebirds. The Suwannee River is a very large freshwater river, 246 miles long, that empties out into the Gulf of Mexico, just north of Cedar Key. And all of this fresh water mixes with salt water and is taken by the currents in the Gulf of Mexico down towards Cedar Key, which kind of protrudes a little bit into the Gulf of Mexico and is surrounded by very shallow, flat substrate in the water. And what this does is it creates really important habitat for oysters. And I have actually been to Cedar Key. You would think that an island in the Gulf of Mexico off of Florida would have lovely white sandy beaches like Sanibel Island or Siesta Key. There are hardly any beaches on Cedar Key. It's mostly all oyster reefs that surround the island. And this creates perfect conditions for oyster catchers to be overwintering, as well as a number of other shorebirds. And they congregate there by the thousands. And it's not just Nantucket birds, it's birds from all along the eastern seaboard. And I want to give a particular shout out to a couple that volunteer their time for Florida Audubon, Doris and Pat Leary, who spend countless hours during the winter in their boat going around and photographing these birds and recording band codes and submitting this information to the Oystercatcher Working Group. A great deal of what we know about where our wintering birds go and spend their time in Florida is due to the hard work of Doris and Pat. Unfortunately, it's been documented that there are some habitat changes on the horizon in this area. The Suwannee River, unfortunately, due to land use patterns further up the river, a lot of fresh water is being pumped out of it. So not as much fresh water is making its way down to Cedar Key. And then also climate change and sea level rise is impacting the areas where these oysters are growing. Just little tiny increments of sea level rise can have devastating impacts on things like oyster reefs. So unfortunately, there might be some changes on the horizon for the habitat that's available in this area. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some individual birds that we have on Nantucket and some of the interesting information that we found out because they are banded and they've been able to be tracked. Yellow band E2 is a bird that used to nest on Eel Point. Unfortunately, E2 is no longer with us, but was regularly observed at Eel Point during the breeding season and regularly observed in Cedar Key, Florida during the winter. In March of 2012, a researcher down in Florida observed E2 in the middle of the day on a Monday. And the following Friday, this bird showed up at Eel Point with its mate ready to begin the nesting season in the middle of the day on Friday. So in a period of roughly 4 days, E2 was able to travel a total straight line distance of 1,100 miles. We don't know the course it took. It could have been much longer than that. And that's an average of about 277 miles a day. So that's pretty incredible for a small bird such as this. We've also gained some really interesting information on international migration. And as I mentioned earlier, some of the birds that leave here that fledge at the end of the season don't come back for 3 years until they reach reproductive maturity. And for some reason, these birds tend to wander outside the country and wind up down in Central America. So yellow band AAR is a bird that was banded in 2014 at first point on COTU. In 2015, it was sighted in Honduras, September of 2015. And then the following August, it was back in the United States in Louisiana. Unfortunately, we haven't had any resights of this bird since then. So it probably is no longer with us. And then yellow AAF was also banded in 2014 on Smith Point. This bird was went somewhere, came back up north 2 years later, was re-seen in Chatham, Massachusetts in June 2016. Then it went over to Tuckernuck Island in August of 2016. The following January 7, 2017, it was observed in El Salvador, back in Florida in April of 2017, and then back on Tuckernuck in July of 2017. So this bird went down south, spent some time in Central America, and then came back. This is another bird that we've been tracking that we actually just found out about this bird this year. This chick was banded last summer on Cotu in June of 2019. The last time we saw it on Cotu was in early July. Somewhere along the line, this bird met up with a bird that was banded in Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, yellow band EC8. And they together seem to be spending some time with a flock of some other unbanded oystercatcher chicks. They were resighted in September in the Yucatan Peninsula, and then just a couple of weeks later, they were seen in Honduras. So we will be eagerly awaiting in a couple of years to see if our yellow band CEX comes back to this area to breed. So all of this information is really cool and interesting, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about why it's important. A lot of what we understand about the migration patterns and the overall ecology of oystercatchers has been improved by having this large population of banded birds. So we've always known where oystercatchers were, but we really had no idea where birds or where populations were going during the winter time. And the only way that you can get that information is if large numbers of birds are banded. So there's been a big improvement in our understanding of their overall ecology. Some of these resites across political boundaries have enabled international research partnerships, which is always a really great thing. The researchers down in Central America obviously knew that there were oystercatchers down there, but they didn't know that those birds were coming from Massachusetts and other places along the Atlantic coast. And so those have fostered some research partnerships with some of the universities that are doing work as part of the Oystercatcher Working Group. And then this work has really improved our understanding of oystercatcher habitat use in terms of both important breeding and wintering areas. When you see a large flock of birds like this consistently in a place like Cedar Key over the course of the winter, and none of those birds are banded, you really don't know if it's the same flock of 1,000 birds that are hanging out there from, say, like October all the way through March, or if some of them leave and then other ones come in, and that it's actually a much larger number of individual birds that are relying on that habitat. And so that information is really important in terms of highlighting habitat protection needs for places where that provide important habitat for these birds, both breeding and overwintering. I just wanted to quickly talk about some of our local characters that we monitor here on Nantucket. This is yellow band J2, which can be found nesting on Second Point on Cotu. And it has been resighted in Chatham, Massachusetts and Charleston, South Carolina. If you look at the places where this bird has nested over the years that we've been monitoring it, you can see that in some cases, this bird nests in exactly the same place year after year after year. And so places like this where birds consistently use the same place, come back to the same place, and in fact, very often nest with the same mate. These are important areas that should be protected to continue to provide them with viable nesting territories. Yellow band F2 is one of our favorite birds here at the Conservation Foundation. This bird is really old. It was banded in 2006 as an adult, so it was at least 3 years old then. So it's close to 17 or 18 years of age. Nests at the entrance of Pulpus Harbor, has been resighted in Florida. This bird, when we first started monitoring it, it consistently nested right next to the high tide line and consistently had its eggs overwashed and didn't seem to be capable of raising chicks, which was really kind of sad to watch year after year. But one of the things that's been encouraging is over the last couple of years, we've seen this pair start to utilize habitat that's further back from the shoreline, that's higher above the high tide line, and F2 and its mate were able to successfully raise 3 chicks in 2019, which was really, really good news for us and encouraging to see that at least in some cases, oystercatchers can quote unquote learn in terms of their nest site selection. And then yellow band 40, this bird was banded in Monomoy National Wildlife Refuge in 2008. Obviously, that was a traumatic experience for it, so it up and left and moved to Eel Point. and nested there pretty consistently for quite a few years. This bird's been seen again in Virginia and Florida. And as you can see from the nest locations of this bird, because Eel Point is a very dynamic habitat that changes from year to year, this pair frequently moves its nest around and picks sites that are based on the habitat that's available during a given year. So finally, I wanted to put a plug in for reporting banded oystercatchers. There are a lot of banded oystercatchers on Nantucket, so chances are if you go out and look for birds here, you're going to see some birds with bands on them. And a lot of the information that we have gathered over the years has come from resites that have been reported by the general public. So I'm just going to quickly give you a bit of a tutorial on some of the things you want to look for if you do see a banded bird. The first thing you want to do is you want to look on and see where the bands are on the legs. The color bands are usually always on the upper left and the upper right. And unless somebody was banding a bird and they were being very incompetent, those codes will always be the same. So they'll never be like E5 on one leg and E6 on another. On the lower left or the lower right, there will be a metal band, which is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service band. You aren't able to read the codes on that. They're too small, but it's important to note which leg that band is on. The next thing you want to note is there a code on the band? The newer bands have 2 to 3 numbers, either in a triangle formation or in a straight line. The codes that are in a straight line often have either an underline or a dot so that you can distinguish whether the code is 4U or U4 versus M6 or 6M. The 2-letter codes are what were originally used when banding started here. And because all of the codes that are used are unique, we quickly ran through all of the available unique codes. And that's why we switched to the 3-letter codes, which are the bands that we're putting on at this point. As I mentioned, the Fish and Wildlife Service band has 9 numbers. It's not field readable, but you would read that number if you were to recapture the bird, or if you were to find the carcass, then you would be able to read that number. Also, a long time ago, before we started doing the coded bands, there were some birds that were banded with just plain color bands with no codes. It's a possibility if you're looking for birds that some of these really old birds could still be around. So next you want to know what's the color of the bands in the codes. As I mentioned, New England is using yellow bands with black codes. But we do sometimes see red bands with white codes here in Massachusetts, and that's because there is a banding program down in Georgia where they band on the wintering grounds. So some of our birds that breed here go down to Georgia, they get captured and they get banded with a red and white band, and they will wind up coming back here. So you want to note that information. And then you want to note whether it's a horizontal code or a triangle code, because that's one of the things that you need to fill out in the form if you were to enter this data on the Oystercatcher Working Group website. So after you've recorded all of this information, you want to put it together and include some information on the date and the time and the location. And you don't have to note latitude, longitude. There's a really cool way that you can just like put a little dot on a map through the website. Take a picture if possible, and then you can report any band that you see online at the Oystercatcher Working Group website. Even if you're not going out in the field to observe oystercatchers, this is a really great resource. It has tons of information on oystercatcher natural history. If any of the information I included tonight has piqued your interest. But if you really get into it and you want to report these bands online, you can actually create your own account. And you can keep track of your oystercatchers and see where they go once they leave Nantucket and where they have been resited in other locations. So I highly recommend this and encourage people to participate because it's a great citizen science project, and a lot of the information that we now know about oystercatchers has been captured by the public and reported through this website. So thank you very much for enjoying oystercatchers. I just want to, there's a lot of people I'd like to thank who are listed here, but in particular, I want to give a big shout out to my colleagues at NCF, my partners in crime. Libby Buck and Neil Foley and Daniel Odell, who they're actually the boots on the ground that get a lot of this work done. I'm the one who gets to talk about it. And then also I wanted to mention Edie Ray. Edie is a local birder who has been involved in this project since the inception and has volunteered countless hours helping us band and recite oystercatchers on Nantucket. And with that, I would be happy to answer any questions and just want to say thank you very much for your interest and for listening.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.
Do you want to stop sharing your screen and then we can, well,
Sure.
We've got questions here.
Okay.
Let's see. So the first question is, have there been any sightings in New England of black oystercatchers from the West Coast?
I don't know of any, but the best way to probably find out that information would be to look on eBird, which is an online recording that birders use when they see common species, but in particular, if someone were to see something unusual like that, they would definitely probably report it in eBird. But I'm not aware of any, but that doesn't mean that they haven't been seen.
Okay. And we have a question that says, why doesn't the Beach Patrol stop and require dog owners to leash their dogs, especially since it's against the law?
That's a bit of a loaded question. We do have a leash law here on Nantucket, and it is very widely unenforced. And I can't really answer the question as to why the Beach Patrol doesn't enforce it, but we actively enforce that rule when it comes to areas where we have nesting birds. So we're always really adamant about making sure that people don't always have their dog on a leash if they're near nesting shorebirds. And in particular, out on Cotu, along with the trustees of reservations, we actually don't even allow dogs on the property from April 1st to September 15th because it's such an important nesting area.
Thank you. So here's someone who says, we live in South Carolina. What parts of South Carolina are the birds nesting in?
Let's see. I would have to look that up. Most of like the national wildlife refuges, and I know Charleston is a place where a lot of our birds have been seen. I don't really know that information off the top of my head, but I can definitely, if that person wants to email me, I can definitely provide them with some specific information in terms of some of our birds and exact locations where they have been recited in South Carolina. So my email address is on the NCF website on nantucketconservation.org. I would be happy if you want to email me to give you some specific information. I'm sorry, I just don't have that off the top of my head. But thank you for joining. Thank you for joining this from South Carolina. That's great.
That is the beauty of doing this virtually.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Oh, we had a question, excuse me, from YouTube that asks, migration patterns of the various populations are interesting and fit my expectations. If you don't need to migrate, why bother?
That is a really good question. And I think a lot of people are asking that question. A lot of researchers are asking that question, not just in terms of oystercatchers, but a lot of birds. You know, birds expend a tremendous amount of energy to migrate to wherever it is they're going. And there's obviously some benefits. Not having to expend that energy to go down to a place like Cedar Key could be a good thing if you want to hang out in New Jersey. But if the food is really plentiful and available, it can actually be beneficial to you to take that risk, to make that long flight, and then to be able to spend the entire winter pretty much gorging on oystercatchers, which improves your overall body fitness and could possibly lead to better breeding success because your body's in good condition and you can lay eggs and go through the stress of the breeding season when you come back. So That's a good question, and I think that's a something that researchers are always asking in terms of why do birds migrate? There are some good guesses and a lot of good research that's been done, but there are still questions that people don't know the answer to.
And it's so interesting that it isn't across the board. You know, it seems like there's a lot of variables.
Yeah, and one of the things I've always been curious about and just haven't had the time to really delve into, but you wonder if it's genetic, if there are some birds, and we do have that information on these birds since they've been banded for over 15 years. We know whose chicks are whose and who's related to who. It'd be really interesting to look and see if certain family groups are the ones that tend to stay local or head south, and do they all go to the same place? If you're related, do you all go to Florida? Or you know, we do sometimes see siblings on the wintering grounds together, so that's interesting. Good question.
Yeah. Let's see. What can we do to encourage more oyster catchers to nest on the island?
I think actually just really respecting all the places where they are nesting right now. And when those areas are posted, you know, staying outside of them, letting them do their thing. Keeping dogs on a leash is a big thing. Not driving in those areas. You know, just there's a lot of people on the island that are out looking for these birds and working really hard to protect them by putting fencing and signage up. And so just really respecting those restrictions and giving them their space to go through with their nesting season, but then also at the end of the year, at this time of the year, these birds are really spending a lot of time feeding and putting on body weight so that they're in good condition to make their migration. So even if it's outside of the nesting season, it's really important to not disturb birds when they're feeding, even if they don't have eggs or chicks. You want to just kind of let them be and let them do their thing and let them have the time and the space to fatten up and get ready for migration, because migration is very metabolically challenging.
For sure. Approximately what percentage of the population of 11,000 have been banded?
I don't know the answer to that question. I could look it up though. If you go on the website, you can see information on how many birds have been banded overall. In some places, a big part of the population is banded, like here on Nantucket. But it really depends on the state and how much banding they're doing and whether they have the resources to actually get out on the ground and catch the birds and put bands on them. So I'm sorry, I don't really know the answer to that question off the top of my head. But again, if somebody wanted to email me with that, I could do a little poking in the data and see if I could come up with some more definitive information.
Okay. And the final question, I think you've already covered it. Just asked, how do you report the sighting of a banded bird? And I think you covered that pretty well.
Yeah, if you just go to AMOYWG for workinggroup.org, there's lots of great information there and a portal for entering data like that.
Great. Any final words for us?
No, I just want to thank everyone for listening. And again, thank you to the Atheneum for giving us an opportunity to do presentations like this. We appreciate your listening and thank you very much.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.